go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Madeline Fitzgerald, and I am the manager of adult programs here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas. On behalf of the museum, I would especially like to welcome and thank our members who are watching this evening. It is because of your generosity that our collection and special exhibitions are free and open to everyone. If you are not currently a member, I encourage you to join by visiting our website at cartermuseum.org. We especially want to thank the Meta Alice Keith Bratton Foundation for their support of Natasha Bowden's installation in the Night Garden. Additionally, I am thrilled that the Carter is partnering with the TCC Sign Language Program, and I am so thankful for their support of our talk this evening. If you haven't been to the Carter recently, I strongly recommend a visit. We have two incredible exhibitions opening in 2 weeks that you won't want to miss. Imagined Realism, Scott and Stuart Gentling is a comprehensive retrospective featuring more than 150 works by these Fort Worth artists that showcases their visionary artistic careers. In the exhibition, Anila Kwayam Aga, A Beautiful Despair, which is an immersive, site-specific installation of new works commissioned by the Carter by the DFW-connected Pakistani American artist. Member preview days to explore these new shows before the crowds will occur on September 23rd and 24th, and the exhibitions will open to the public on Saturday, September 25th, which just so happens to also be our 60th birthday bash. Celebrating the museum's opening in 1961, we'd love for you to join us to celebrate 60 years with a free outdoor event. We'll have lots of hands-on art making opportunities, a VIP area for Carter members, food trucks, beer and wine, and live performances by Fort Worth's DJ Ronnie Hart and Austin-based Americana musician Shaky Graves. And following the concert, we'll have a huge fireworks show. We hope you will visit the museum on Saturday, September 25th, and celebrate our 60th year with us. And you can learn more about the birthday bash at the link that I am just sent in the chat. We also have 2 upcoming exhibition talks related to these new exhibitions. On Thursday, October 14th, as part of our brand new program, Second Thursdays at the Carter. Please join us in person to hear from Anila Aga, who will share the stories behind her new works in the exhibition, A Beautiful Despair. There will be lots of other things to do during that evening in addition to hearing Anila speak. So check out more info about the Second Thursdays at the Carter. Again, sending another link in the chat. And lastly, in support of the Imagined Realism exhibition, we will be having a day of lectures exploring all things Gentling. You'll be able to hear from the scholars and curators who helped shape this exhibition throughout the day. And you can learn about Scott and Stuart Gentling's role in the DFW art scene, how they fit into the mid-century art world, and all about their fascination with various subject matters, including the Aztec Empire. You can join for one lecture or all 3, eat lunch on site, and toast the speakers and the memory of the Gentlings during our reception and book signing after. More details about the lecture topics can be found here. So this evening, we have the pleasure of being joined by Natasha Bowden, who will speak about her work. And then afterwards, Carter curator Shirley Reese Hughes will join in for a chat on the exhibition in the Night Garden. After that, we'll transition into a Q&A with all of you. You can submit a question by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or if you're watching from an iPad, I believe it's on the top. Feel free to submit questions throughout the talk using that Q&A function, and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can at the end. If you have any questions or problems during the program, please use the chat function to reach out to me. I'll be there and can help with anything you may need. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today. Artist Natasha Bowden pushes the boundaries between drawing, painting, sculpture, and installation. Known for her cut paper, collage-based work and site-responsive installations, she investigates the potential intersections of the visual and the literary, channeling the experience of reading into the activity of drawing while reimagining our relationship to the natural world. Born and raised in West Kennebunk, Maine, Bowden went on to receive her BA from Brandeis University in Classics and Studio Art and her MFA from the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. She has been awarded numerous residencies, including fellowships at the CORE program in Houston, the Roswell Air program in New Mexico, and the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha. Bowden is currently a visual arts professor at Rice University in Houston. She has presented her work in solo and group exhibitions at numerous galleries and museums nationally and throughout Europe. She received a Joan Mitchell Foundation Fellowship Grant in 2007, and her work has been reviewed in publications including Art Forum, Bomb, and Wallpaper Magazine. Bowden is represented by Manya Row Gallery in New York and Tally Dunn Gallery in Dallas. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your work and the incredible installation in the Night Garden.
Thank you, Madeline, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I wish I could see all your faces, but I will imagine them in my mind. And before I share my screen and kind of walk you all through the interiors of my mind for a while, I just want to thank everyone at the Amen, Madeline for all her help organizing this event, and a very special thank you to Shirley for really making everything possible, feeding the Night Garden itself, and the whole Amen crew. Everyone there was really amazing to work with, and it's a very special memory, despite being in the middle of a pandemic. So thank you again for the opportunity. And I also want to shout out to Tally Dunn Gallery, my pit crew in Dallas, who also nothing would be possible without their support. So thank you to them too. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we will look at some things together. So, and I'll set my timer so I kind of keep myself on track. So I wanted to share some images, of course, of my work, but also some of the things that feed my practice, and that have been of interest to me for a long time now. What I like about artist talks is when you get to sort of peer behind the curtain a little bit and see what the artist is looking at and what's feeding their practice. And so this first batch of images is really things that I've collected over the years. Some images go way, way back. Some are a little bit more new and fresh. But these are the things that I kind of keep around, keep close as I'm making work, and they really inform, they're really the wellspring of the work itself. So as Madeline mentioned, I grew up in Maine, relatively rurally. I come from a family of primarily fishermen on my mom's side and stonemasons on my dad's. So as you can imagine, I was outside a lot in my youth, and that very much informed the artist I am today. I think it really had a hand in kind of crafting what I'm interested in and what's kept me fascinated for basically since I was a kid, roaming around the woods and the water. So, one of the things that really a sort of through line in my work is a fascination with how we seek to relate to the natural world, how we try to connect with it, how we attempt to see ourselves within it. And so that has really guided, I think, probably everything I've ever produced as an artist, if I had to sort of pin it down to one thing. So I thought it would be appropriate to start with an image of a woman investigating a giant clamshell, to give you a sense of what kind of how I collect these things and how they live in my studio. This is just an older shot of a studio wall at one point in time. So you can kind of see how these images populate and exist around me. And, funny enough, or I think it's sort of, I guess it's kind of ironic that I grew up in Maine. I was outside a lot, but really where my interest in nature, my research in nature primarily lies is through the realm of books. So while nature itself is completely fascinating in all its physical manifestations, ironically, I'm sort of terrified of real nature at times, like I'm sure many of us often are. And as a kid, part of my interest was trying to sort of time travel and physically travel, in a sense, through the realm of books to kind of see different ideologies, seeing different people's relationships to nature, what those looked like across time and space. And so a lot of what I look at kind of comes out of artists' interpretations of the natural world, other artists, other naturalists, other writers. And so while I love nature itself, despite being slightly terrified of it, I often kind of gravitate towards first looking at other artistic interpretations of the natural world. And particularly what I'm fond of or curious about is the desire for, or the compulsion humans have to sort of hold nature up like a mirror to oneself. So I look at a lot of things where the desire is to sort of see oneself in the world around them. I find those images very fascinating. I think also they philosophically stand for a worldview that I myself want to embody, which I'll speak more about in a moment. But I like that compulsion of trying to find the human in the other creatures on the planet. And vice versa, and kind of see where those boundaries might mix and cross. And specifically, I look at a lot of imagery, kind of 19th century and earlier. And there's a few reasons for that. One primary one is sort of before the advent of photography, before the camera takes over as our documentarian of the natural world. You have everyone drawing things by hand. And when that happens, you get a lot of, humans are inadequate. I say that lovingly. We don't get everything right. And so you get these really interesting combinations of like a whale with a weirdly human grin and a strangely human eyeball that doesn't quite look right. And part of that comes out of just the imperfect qualities of our hand. Part of it comes out of like kind of wanting to see something that is in another entity that we want to draw out. And so I find those kind of corruptions really interesting. And also kind of, the earlier you look back, the more often you get a kind of interesting commingling of science and myth that starts to happen, which I also find really fascinating. So I look at a lot of imagery, 1900s and earlier. And another thing that's really important, and I apologize that I'm not speaking directly to all these, what I think are amazing images that are going by, but that would be probably, we would be here till 1 a.m. So I won't do that. But I try to look also really across the planet as much as I can. So another thing that kind of binds these images together in my mind are also looking at peoples and cultures who embrace this idea that boundaries are not so fixed between, say, human and animal or human and weather, that these things might actually be more in flux than we typically allow them to be, I guess I should say, in Western civilization. I'm really fascinated by that idea that of shapeshifting, of transformation, of one thing being able to morph into another, and what that means in terms of how you relate to it. If you can be something else, maybe you might be more inclined to understand it. So that's a kind of another thing that binds this natural imagery together in my mind. And there's other things too that I find fascinating, like artists' sort of desire to place order on something that is ultimately pretty chaotic and pretty unnerving when you really think about it. So I find that interesting too. You see like all these human compulsions when you look at the history of botanical illustration, for example. You can kind of see human desire and what it's seeking, and why it's kind of trying to place order on these things that ultimately have their own laws that they abide that might be very different from ours. So those are kind of some of the things that tie all this imagery together. I promise I'll get to my own work in a moment. And the other thing too is that, over the years of collecting this imagery, I've found that there's an interesting connection to kind of looking at symbolism of the natural world, and also looking at how women have been represented in art. I think there's a kind of kinship that women and animals have been able to kind of carve out culturally, because both have often been marginalized. So I find that really interesting too. And that's kind of become more and more of a current contemporary interest of mine that I've been getting into in work as of late, which I'll come back to when we get to later work. And then I'm a child of the 80s, so I can't not pay homage to the cartoons that I grew up on, which were many and frequent. My dad was a really avid Disney fan, and so I loved old Disney, Looney Tunes, Hanna-Barbera. And I love them because I was a kid, and what's not to love when you're a kid with Saturday morning cartoons? But when I still love them now, and I think the more that I watch them too, actually, the more I've found some of what I love about, reading about shapeshifters and transformation is present in the cartoon world, is lauded in the cartoon world, is placed on a real, is showcased. Cartoons are amazing in terms of what's possible, how something can morph into something else, like what something can be or what something can have the potential to be. And so I actually think that cartoons are kind of profound that way. And so they very much inform my practice too, which you'll see in the visuals as we get to those presently. And then I had to put Pee-wee's Playhouse in here because I grew up on that as well. There's something about the mania of it that I love, which I try to cultivate in my own work. And like the, kind of overabundance of pattern and color and chaos that I am very much drawn to. So thank you, Pee-wee's Playhouse, for that. And the last source image, before I show you some of my work itself, this is a drawing by Ralph Waldo Emerson it's an illustration of a concept that he wrote about when he was kind of laying the foundation for transcendentalism, which is this notion of the transparent eyeball. Again, just to go back to the notion of this kind of more boundaryless existence. He advocated for an eyeball that, rather than sucking everything in that it intakes in the world, that it's permeable, it's a membrane. So actually things are passing in both directions. And so this idea that you are a part of the world that you intake, you're not just the spectator or the consumer, but you also kind of give and take of it yourself. Leaving something of yourself behind in the world as you look on. And I think that's just a philosophy that runs through a lot of the source material that I gravitate towards. And to be honest, is a way of being in the world that I I would, it's a constant process, but that I seek to emulate. So that's kind of that's maybe a lot compressed, but those are some of the things that I'm thinking about, looking at, that have influenced me over the years. And I thought I would show a few really early works, just a few from when I actually was a student in graduate school, just to show kind of my roots, that I actually started out as a more straightforward painter per se on canvas, and sort of quickly, I guess this is a theme that I don't like boundaries, quickly felt like I was constantly battling the edges of things. Didn't want to deal with the edge of a canvas, didn't want to deal with the edge of a piece of paper. And so that's what led me to cutting things up. And that has very much remained a part of the way I work to this day, even though the materials have shifted over the years. So I started cutting paper. This was, I think, my first kind of cut paper piece that really came together. It's called Octopus Words. And I have a detail just to give you a sense of what it looks like close up. I tried to keep the material simple: graphite, paper, scissors, X-Acto. But the idea is that the work could kind of grow more organically and not always have to deal with a hard edge. And this is there's two other pieces from this time period. This is Paper Tiger, which is again cut paper, ink and gouache, and cut up playing cards that I reassembled to create this kind of tiger headdress mask formation. And the third piece from this same show, Water Fable. And so I was really it was sort of my first foray, I guess, into installation in a way. Even though the work's gotten a lot more aggressive over the years, this was kind of the first attempt to sort of work a little bit more inside a space in a slightly more intense way, still having the edge of the wall to deal with, but having a little bit more freedom in terms of how things could organically come together. So the other, I compressed this into 2 slides, so I don't just show you more and more source material, even though it's always a temptation of mine. The other kind of body of reference material that I'm constantly collecting is text-based materials, specifically alternative, more visually unexpected manifestations of text. So you see Robert Smithson's Heap of Language on the left and Lewis Carroll's A Mouse's Tale, which some of you might recognize, on the right. At some point, I've always been interested in storytelling that naturally goes, I think, with a lot of the natural imagery I'm looking at anyway, that there's a myth component or a fable or a folktale element. And at a certain point, I wanted to figure out if I could use text in a way as a kind of material. And so I started looking around for other examples of kind of unexpected ways to visualize text. Some of them being kind of funny and cheeky, and some being a little bit more aggro and antagonistic. You have a kind of playful animal type down at the bottom. There's a Leon Ferrari Dictionario piece on the right, and then Jack Kerouac's original manuscript for On the Road, which basically doesn't have any punctuation in it, which I kind of love the antagonism of that towards the reader. And so I've been collecting these things and then tried to figure out a way to kind of attempt my own version of that. So this is sort of my first text piece. It was a transcription of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. So you see a detail view here, and then you can kind of see a scale view here. And, the part of the joy of this for me was treating that text as a raw material and shuffling it around. So you kind of lose the beginning, you lose the end. You sort of have to immerse yourself in the flow of his text in a very different way than you would be allowed to do if you were just reading it left to right. And so this kind of spawned a series of works, and the spirit of working this way has lingered with me up to present day, in the sense that these works never go together the same way twice. They sort of defy finality. They're never finished. They always have potential to be something else, which I really like. Clearly. So this is another installation of the same drawings that have a wall painting behind them. So this is actually the first time I painted on the wall too. But the idea being that like the text could infinitely be reshuffled and re-examined with every new installation. This led me to like a lot of work that I'm just going to show you 3 examples of that had to do with text. So this is actually another Alice inspired piece called Contrariwise. That's the text of Tweedledee and Tweedledum kind of repeated through the material of cut paper. So you can kind of see it a little bit better in the close-up view here. And this is a image of on the left, an overview, and then on the right, a detail, so you can kind of get a sense of the density of another text piece I did of a transcription of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, a portion of it, not the entirety of the book. Then I would be insane. And I wanted to hang on to sanity at that moment. But yeah, so like over the years, I've kind of forced these collaborations with writers that had no choice really. But a lot of people ask me, why certain writers, what attracted you to certain texts? And part of it was a selfish reason of what I wanted to read incredibly meticulously in the studio, because I literally would sit down with the book in one hand and a pencil in the right and transcribe word for word, much like a scribe would do back in the day. But also it kind of came out of looking for writers who create particular senses of rhythm with their writing. With Melville, it was like the idea of an author writing about macroscopic themes through microscopic detail. I mean, reading that text is like, it feels like an endurance test sometimes. It's like, how much can you read about rope? Like, I'm going to see how far I can get my reader to go. But then you realize that he's talking about much larger themes through that detail. So it was trying to find different writers that had those different senses of like how a text might operate, that are not just bound to like, you read left to right and that's how you move through. And the plot goes forward and that's how the story goes. So trying to find different iterations, different approaches to that was something that inspired me. And this leads me to, I wanted to kind of get into the garden work, since that's very much part and parcel of what In the Night Garden deals with. I wanted to show you the roots of that work, no pun intended. And ironically, I think they started in the desert, actually. I went to Roswell, New Mexico in 2013 for a residency, the Roswell Air Program. And while the desert I learned, was a very full of life landscape, some of the life being quite terrifying, it was very different from the landscapes that I knew up until that point. And so strangely, I was kind of longing for like lush greenery when I was out there, before I learned to appreciate the desert in its own way. And so I started to make these botanical inspired pieces. They started actually as an homage, kind of a love letter to an artist that I've always loved, Henry Darger, who you see here. I wanted to kind of make him his own bouquets, sort of inspired by these landscapes that his characters occupied. And so this is, these pieces are early botanical cut paper works, pretty small in scale, or small for me. And they were called Flowers for Henry. They were really sort of thought about as like kind of offerings back to, an important artist in my own making. And then eventually those flowers grew. They grew more aggressive. They grew a lot larger. This was kind of the first big floral piece that I'm just teasing with here, but I'll show you the full reveal in a second. At the SCAD Museum, Savannah College of Art and Design Museum in Savannah. And so this is actually not it in its entirety. Its wings are kind of clipped here, but it was the largest piece that I had done at the time. Envisioned again around the same idea of never going together the same way twice. And so I'll talk about process in a minute, because I know a lot of people are often very curious about how these things come to be. But yeah, so this is kind of how the gardens had their sort of smaller beginnings and then eventually sort of grew over time. And with each new installation, as I got more comfortable working that way and working on site, they would take on really different personalities often. So this is a piece that I did, I think in 2017, called Lunar Spring, where I tried to imagine what springtime might look like on the moon, if the moon had a springtime. And, you know, radically obviously changed the palette. Also over time, I've started to try to, it's taken a while, but move my way from the wall to other planes. So sort of engaging the floor, bringing the work out into space, which the Night Garden does a lot more aggressively than this early work here. You can see they're just like taking baby steps away from the wall at this point. And then this is a kind of later iteration of the garden called Maneater, where things get a little bit more aggressive. I think this was definitely inflected by the politics of the time, and feeling a certain way about being a woman in the world definitely influenced how this work came to be. So here you see it from kind of the outside view, walking up to the museum. This is at Mass MoCA in North Adams in Massachusetts. And then I've got an inside view so you can kind of get a sense. They're hard to capture in full because they tend to be unwieldy. So this was about 100 feet long, kind of narrow because the space itself was narrow, but very sort of snaked down the entire hallway. Maneater being a reference to the classic Hall & Oates 80s song, but also a Nico Case song that talks about our relationship to the environment. And so this piece kind of grew out of an initial interest that has run through into the Night Garden show around this idea of language of the flowers, which initially was a Victorian practice of communicating through bouquets. So sort of like what I love about it is it's actually using nature as a language at a time when, you know, women especially weren't really permitted to say much of anything direct or frank or real. Because of, you know, class basically being suppressed at all angles. So using this kind of language of subterfuge in certain ways, you could be, you know, you could be cheeky, you could be frank, you could be direct in a way that just using direct, you know, speech was not permitted or encouraged. And so I started thinking about like, okay, well, what would my bouquet maybe want to say at this moment? I'm not going to tell you right now, but those are the thoughts that I was thinking of when I was putting this piece together. So I put together like a little batch of images that speak to process, because I think that is very much an important way these things come to be. The process is key. It's very organic and it's very intuitive. I hate plans. I do terribly planning, actually. On the occasion when I've had to have a plan, it hasn't gone to plan. So I really do much better when chance is involved in the process, when things unexpected can come to bloom. So given that, I tend to work on a lot of work at once, and well, you'll see, I'll show more images that kind of, again, they'll go back to this notion of chance and how to manifest it in the studio, but it is really important to my practice my practice is also super organic. So I don't throw anything out. You can see I've got like paper shavings. This is an older studio now that I no longer occupy, but I keep everything around. I like to have a little chaos in the studio. And often when I'm working with paper, I start with drawing. It always starts with drawing. Then color becomes involved, text if there's going to be text, and then cutting. And the cutting is really an extension of the drawing. I would say they feel like the same muscle to me now, having done both of them so frequently. I use really simple tools. I don't like anything. I try to avoid fancy things if I can help it. I like just an X-Acto blade, scissors, ink, pencil, gouache, house paint. I just like to keep it to the basics. I often, when I'm cutting something large, I like to sit on it, which feels kind of weird to say, but there's like a contact thing that can happen. Like I feel like connected to it when I'm close to the material. So I try to hand cut everything myself. Occasionally there's been exceptions to that when I've had to use different materials that I physically can't cut. But if I have my choice, I like to do every single part alone in the studio, if I can manage it. I think that's the New Englander in me, although I know other states have that mentality too. And then the more chaos, the better. This is just an example of chaos. The painting part of my practice, which has really come back in full force over the past maybe 5 years, also embraces cutting as part of the process. But I do it in a certain way to kind of channel the cartoon iconography that I'm always trying to go after. So over the years, I've had this desire for this kind of crisp edge that is very part and parcel of cartoon language, I would say. And so how I get that is I paint through masking material, which you can see an image of here on the right. And here on the left, actually. So this is on site, and then this is in the studio. The masking material is essentially giant masking tape that I can draw on and then cut through, peel off, and then paint with a roller. And so when it's dry and I peel the tape off, that's what gives it a very sharp, crisp edge, which I will admit I love. So while when I'm just drawing kind of on a small scale in the studio, I like to be loose and kind of messy with things. When I jump up in scale, I often sort of change the process so that I can get a really particular kind of edge to the work. So when I'm working on a large scale piece, like in the Night Garden, I just generate a lot of raw material. So here you can just see I'm just creating blooms like a mad woman in the studio, having no idea how they intentionally how they go together, not thinking about that part at all, and then saving that compositional component to happen in the spot, in the site, kind of like, an improv. A musician would show up with their instrument to a club, but not premeditate what they're going to play because they're improvisational. So that's kind of how those installations come to be. It's a lot of generating raw material first in the studio and then hoping that it will come together when I get it to a site and I have time to actually think about how it might sort of congeal into one, organism or one environment. I sometimes do need help. This is my partner on the right helping me in Virginia with the show. And, eventually starting to work on the floor was a whole new kind of, opened up a whole new can of worms, but in an exciting way. And so that's become more part and parcel of my practice now too, is engaging with the floor. And even in those floor components, those are drawn on site. I could, feasibly one could print a pattern ahead of time and have it pre-cut in vinyl, but I actually like to draw it and cut it on the spot. So you'll see in some Amen images, actually me drawing with chalk and then cutting out just, in the moment. I like the kind of anxiety and potential of not knowing, again, what's going to come out by not premeditating something. And then that kind of brings me, I think, to what I was thinking about for the Eamon Carter show. And so I mentioned kind of books in the beginning. I've a very avid consumer of children's book illustration. It's always been a love of mine, a visual love, often for its crazy color, its pattern, its kind of whimsy, anything's possible. So here you have some children's book illustrations. And then on the right is a piece by Carl Worsom, who is one of the Chicago imagists who just recently passed away, actually. And I love the images too. I mean, I think they were interested in a lot of the same visuals that I've been interested in over the years. And there's a zaniness and a frenetic quality to the imagist drawings that and paintings that I really, really love. So that was kind of an influence as well. And then these are a couple images from Le Fleur Ennemie, which was a text by J.J. Granville. Again, like a classic example of this desire of kind of anthropomorphizing or personifying nature and sort of conflating like humans and the natural. So here he would do illustrations for different flowers that would take on different sort of human forms. They're really beautiful drawings, I think. And another influence that kind of factored into the Eamon show and Sideways to the Sun, which happened right before In the Night Garden, is looking at George Méliès's films like Voyage to the Moon. I've been really into, like, I've always wanted to do an opera set design. It hasn't totally happened yet. So if anyone out there needs that, give me a call. But I love the kind of lo-fi quality of Méliès, and yet it's totally transformative. And you'll see that I kind of took this idea of these like stage wagons that are very homemade in a sense, but are meant to be transportive, in this case, to the moon, as an idea for how I might approach my own work and get it to sort of physically manifest in the space in a different way. And then the other thing that's kind of been new for me is thinking about interaction and performance. And so above is Nikki D. St. Phal, one of her Nana pieces, collaborations, actually. And then Marvin Gaye Chetwynd on the bottom, an amazing performance artist, I think. So I was thinking about, like, how do I get people to, like, how can I make painting installations as a kind of site for action has been a big recent motivation. I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to kind of skate through some of these so quickly so I can show you guys a video clip as well before Shirley and I talk about In the Night Garden. So this was kind of my first foray into trying to make a work that could be a site for performance and trying to get the work to be a little more sculptural. This was at the Moody Center for the Arts on Rice campus, where I teach. And the work was called Sideways to the Sun. And here's a shot of it in progress. So you can kind of see it's like it has its final trimmings. It's very much like a living, working collage. So I arrive with all these pieces and it looks kind of insane for a while. And then I just try to figure out where they might go, how they might fit, how they might populate in an interesting way. And there's a fair amount of painting that happens on site as well. And then in this case, vinyl on the floor that I cut akin to the In the Night Garden show. Along with some other kind of sculpture elements that existed out from the kind of main wall itself. And with performance in mind, and not being a performer myself and not ever wanting to be one, I wanted to offer my work as a site for other performance artists to engage with. So I invited two groups. Poncili Creacion was the first group. They are an amazing performance collective puppetry troupe out of Puerto Rico. They perform all over the world, all over in any manner of stage, lo-fi to hi-fi. I think they prefer lo-fi actually, but they agreed to come to the Moody for a week, and we made puppets together with students. Here you see one of the puppets here. And then they put on a puppet show inside the work. So you can kind of see in the back here, we've got participants ready to enact this short, strange play. This was making puppets the week leading up to the performance. So these are some of my students and other colleague students working on some of the puppets. They actually use upholstery foam and paint, really lo-fi materials. And here is just a view, I'm not sure, just so you can see them testing out one of the bike puppets before we painted it. And so that was really amazing to sort of open the work up to something so unpredictable and out of my hands, and allow it to be the site for something else. And the other, two more images, because I just love what happened here and wanted to share it with you all tonight. This is them taking a bow at the end, which I love. And then the other performer I invited is a performance artist out of New York, Machine Dazzle. He is known in the drag world. He does all the costuming for Taylor Mack, also a really well-known performance artist himself. And Machine agreed to come out, check out the work, and make something in response to the installation that would be performed as well. And so he arrived for a week, made a series of costumes, and then we had 7 performers and volunteers. So some professional dancers, some students who had never performed before, a couple friends who wanted to get in a costume, and Machine. And these are some stills from that performance. If I have time, I'm going to show you a 3-minute clip that gives you a little bit of a sense of it was sort of a 3-act performance. But here's all the models in their full amazing glory at the end of the performance. So if there's time, let me stop my share and can I hand it over to you, Madeline, to show the clip?
Yes, absolutely. I think there is definitely time, and I think everyone's going to want to watch this.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
place for me. Burning down the inner belt, from jacuzzi to jacuzzi. It's alright for you, man.
Thank you, Madeline, for sharing that.
No problem.
And that brings me, I guess, kind of an abrupt cut, but actually it brings me to In the Night Garden. So let me just put this image up, and then I have some images, but maybe we should get Shirley on stage, and we can talk more specifically about In the Night Garden and how it grew.
I love this. I'm getting on stage in the virtual world. Thank you so much, Natasha. I mean, I learned so much from you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the work that you've put into this installation. And I just, because we just watched Machine Dazzle perform in the installation that you did for Moody, it just made me think about how your installation was inspirational to Machine Dazzle. And then they did a performance that was inspirational to us. And this sort of moving it forward of inspiration that your work does and did for the group. And then the group sends it to us. And I loved also the constant performance piece of talking on the phone and the old-fashioned phone.
Yeah.
But that idea of communication that was central to what they were doing. And I just wanted, and I was thinking about, with your installation that you did for the Carter, how you might see, the visitor, because Machine Dazzle was inspired and created something, how you hope the visitor is affected when they come into the space and experience it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think with the Carter work, let me cut to a image that kind of shows this, trying to make a space that implicates the viewer, and that maybe sounds like kind of serious in a way that I don't mean it to, but involves them or invites them to be a physical part of, I think is something that my work has headed towards or flirted with for a while, but it took a while to kind of get it to fully, well, I think it's still moving in that direction. But the idea of like painting the space in such a way, using the floor and then painting the other side wall of the Amen to try to create like almost like a cocoon that you walk into and then become a part of, I think is not only interesting like formally, but is also maybe speaks to what the work is about at its core, which is trying to like, without hammering anyone over the head about it, trying to make the argument that like we are very much a part of nature, even though I think, nowadays we sort of do our best, or many of us do our level best to try to sort of section it off and contain it. And so, yeah, I hope this answers your question. Now I feel like the question is sliding from my fingertips. But,
no, I think this is an ongoing conversation because, I want to address something that, it came across to me once I came into the space. And I'll start off by saying, before you had installed, I think one of the employees at the museum said, oh, I'm a gardener and I can't wait to kind of identify the species in her garden. And I thought, well, I don't know how identifiable these are, but what I appreciated so much is as I after you installed it, standing in the space and realizing that, yes, you might have been inspired by a poppy, but it's really a mixture of perhaps a poppy and a lotus and a hibiscus all put together.
Mm-hmm.
And that this was really a metaphor for humankind, and this idea of transformation and change, and that these boundaries, as you talked about so beautifully, are fluid, and that there are differences, and that we can step outside these, the nomenclature or the identification of a species, and be more accepting and open to differences. And I think you did that beautifully, but I also wonder, because this was kind of, I think, your first nighttime theme, and maybe you want to address that. I'm sorry, I'm making a complicated question, but
no.
If you want to talk about night, and maybe if I'm leading you in the right way about that kind of metaphor of humankind, that a microcosm of a worldly place that's more interconnected and open.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think those sentiments are very much connected. The idea of the night and the idea of hybridity and not knowing something. I mean, the reason the night is interesting is because you can't see completely what you're experiencing. So I mean, if you, the night has, just like the ocean, which has also been a major through line in much of my work too. They've always been metaphors for the unknown, both the uncomfortable qualities of that and the potential. I mean, the night is terrifying, but it's also ripe for possibility. And I think great writers recognize that. Think of, I mean, I feel like that's a constant theme in Shakespeare and many other literature out there. And I think so it's interesting, I get the compulsion to want to identify the world and classify, and I'm certainly not anti-science in any way, shape, or form. But I also think there's a way of experiencing that world in terms of potential that's valuable too. And sometimes to do that, you have to sort of turn off one view to access another. And so the night just seemed like, to try to do something in the night seemed like why haven't I done that before? It just seems like a really ripe metaphor for trying to get at this notion of potential and not really feeling like you know what you're looking at, but having a sense of it. I mean, it's kind of like when I feel like kids are good at this because they kind of engage with the world in a way that they don't have the weight of all the knowledge yet. So they can kind of see things and make connections in a way that are truly poignant and sharp and completely farcical and magical all at the same time. And so I think that's, for me, it's like I try to channel that whenever I can. And so making something that was under the guise of night, just it felt like the right environment to do that, even in terms of also like the creatures that live there too, that are symbolically have always been, I think, agents of transformation because they're under the cloak of night in part.
Yeah. And because I mean, I don't know much about insects at all, but your beautiful moths that you created, and like the Luna moth, which is the one on the farthest right of the screen. And when I was looking it up, it was like they're known for their wide wingspan. And I thought, well, she's really depicted it more in this very almost cocoon-like shape. And I thought, because so much of what you're communicating, if I'm getting this right, is about transformation and almost that cocoon where the pupa is, evolving into the adult. And I wondered if that was your intention with, for example, the insects in the show.
Yeah, it's an interesting read. I feel like it would be disingenuous of me to say it was part of the initial plan, because I those drawings actually start in such a, it's funny. I'm a teacher by day, and I teach drawing and painting, and I would never like tell my students to make a drawing the way that I make my drawings. Like, it's just the thing that like I would tell them not to do, which is weird to say out loud. But those drawings start as like, I start in the center and I just start to make these little calligraphic marks, and then they grow out from their center. And they usually have color first. I just do the color kind of as a random free for all wash. And then the black kind of builds the insect from the center out. And so part of it is like just sort of figuring out, like, when I bump into an edge, like, what am I going to do here? But I also just liked that they read like almost like sentinels, or like these kind of guardians that are in this position of, not of the typical position of beauty, which we all want to see nature in. We want to see its wings spread. We want to see it in its full splendor. I mean, that's how insects are pinned when they're collected and presented. So that was trying to like come up with a different pose, or embracing a different pose that feels like a little bit more confrontational, a little bit more stoic, and also maybe even kind of human, because they feel like they sort of have our dimensions a little bit. I think that was something that kind of guided how they ended up being, but also it was just part because I kind of ran into the edge of the paper also.
And, before I forget this question, because I don't think we've had a chance to talk about it, is if you would explain why paper is your media, of choice, like that's your preferred medium.
Yeah. I just love it because it's forgiving. It's infinitely mutatable. It feels kind of humble. I mean, I know you can get very fancy paper and you can really fuss over the material, but I also like that it holds, it shows the environment. It shows how it's been handled. It has like a memory that, can be infuriating sometimes. If you want something to be pristine, paper is not often going to give that to you. But I think also just it's organic and I can cut it easily. And so the idea that, I can sort of change, like I can change a drawing midway through if I want to, because something can always be cut out and put into something else, or, vice versa. I think that's what's always drawn me to paper, and in the end, for sure.
And out of curiosity, how much does the accident, like an accident, a mistake, fall into your process?
I would say all the time, all the time. I mean, it's interesting because I actually think it's, when you work with a material for a long time, you practice, you start to know it well. And so it's actually harder to manifest accident. Of course, there's always things that can happen, but like for me, I've noticed that when I've found the need to kind of jump to a material, it's often around this hinge point where I think like, well, I'm not getting as much accident as I would like, or I'm not getting as much chance as I need to bring back into this. And so I think that is something that like I'm sort of constantly searching for, and in part, in a way, like kind of led to the performances too, because those are things that are not controllable by me. So they are, I mean, they're not exactly accidents, but they are kind of trying to inject back in a realm of, or an attribute of chance and unpredictability that I think it's hard when you get to know a material really well, you start to get to, it's just harder to manifest those blunders over and over again, but I still look for them. I mean, I still love, that's why I like to start with color first without a notion of what it's going to be attached to. I mean, that's not exactly an accident, but it is, it's a disregard for what will happen next. So I think it's in the same universe, I guess, as chance and accident.
That makes sense. And I want to say, I know, and we've talked about this because so many people have walked in the space, and you had said this at the beginning, people are leaving their scuff marks on the vinyl, and people are leaving, slight tears. And I know at first the staff was concerned about that. Like, oh, should we be scrubbing? Should we be washing this vinyl off? And I kind of kept saying, no, that's Natasha wants that to become part of the work. And so in a way, it's less direct, but it shows the footprints of our visitors and their immersion in your work. And that's not always true of artists. There's not every artist wants that to be happening to their artwork. But I don't, there's not a question there, but I just love that about you and your work. But I think somebody brought this up, and I think it's a good point. I saw it fly across the chat, is how long does it take you, like when you were creating the installation for the Carter, and I watched you, you responded spontaneously to your pieces, but I think people might like to hear how you did that.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I think I was on site for 2.5 weeks. That's right? Right. It was kind of a blur, a bit, because of just installation mid-pandemic was something that was new to me. So I think that messed with my sense of time. So with this show, a lot of the blooms that you see here, so some of the carts and the flowers had been made ahead of time. So they had populated the Moody installation in different forms and iterations. Some of them got kind of Frankensteined and hacked up, and eventually sometimes as I go from, I feel like I'm describing myself like a traveling carnival barker or something, but going from installation to installation, things can only handle so much wear and tear, and then they start to kind of disintegrate and become something else, or they just kind of fall in, occasionally fall by the wayside. But so, I mean, a lot of the raw material had been made ahead of arriving at the Carter. And then it was trying to think about what to add and how to come up with a new iteration that really does channel this very different kind of environment. Because the Moody, as you probably noticed in those images, is suffused with light. There's a giant floor to ceiling bank of windows. You wouldn't be able to replicate the night without really modifying aggressively the architecture. So trying to figure out how to do that on site. And you can see, I really do treat the materials like a collage, and moving them around, and occasionally needing a lot of hands to do that, because these pieces were getting bigger and bigger, and more aggressive. So a lot of my time on site was just trying to find the right configuration, the right composition to create this feeling of growth, and, to ultimately channel something that's meant to read organically, even though it's totally artificial, in every sense of the word. And here's an image of us working on the floor, me and my assistant, Sarah. And then the floor was kind of the last, I think, one of the last pieces of the puzzle. And like I said, I just kind of drew that out I use sidewalk chalk actually, because it's a nice drawing material that can be erased. And so trying to find a way to like channel the forms on the wall and the walls to migrate across the floor. And, like constantly looking for this tension between figuration and abstraction, which is something I haven't really mentioned, but it's definitely like a very big part of my work. It's like trying to get something that feels organic, but also kind of, like feels like it could be nameable, but you can't quite figure out what it is you're looking at, is something that like I really do seek out in the forms that I draw. So trying to find that balance, I feel like that was a lot of my time on site as well. I hope that answers the question.
That was wonderful. No, I think that was really helpful. And it was fun having a chance to sort of see you as you were looking at your different components and putting them together in different ways. And this kind of sense, like you said, there's this tension. It's organic, yet it's, artificial in that it's a construction. Mm-hmm. It's natural and buoyant, yet it's threatening. And then it's static, yet it's writhing, because I think that's what you did so well with the shadows that continue onto the floor and then onto the wall behind your framed works of art. And you mentioned collage, and it's a collage process, putting it all together. As you do in that sense, but also your drawings that are framed, those are mostly collages. And I wonder when collage came to you as a practice, because you talked about starting as a painter, and then we saw some of your early works that were like collage. And I just wonder how that came into your process.
Yeah, I didn't put an image in of any of these, but when I first made the jump from oil painting to paper, the kind of intermediary jump was cutting up my paintings. So I just started to cut up oil paintings and then collage the pieces onto other substrates. And then at the same time I was doing a lot of like monoprinting, like really crude on the floor of my studio, monoprinting, where, you just like lay down some ink on the floor and throw some paper on it and draw on the back of it, and then pull up these prints that have this like really wonderful line quality to them because of the kind of ink that distortion that you get. And so originally that collage was kind of the intermediary step. And, always comes back like in and out of my work consistently since I made that jump many, many years ago. I just like the freedom of it. I mean, it just feels like with collage, like nothing is off limits. Also, it has like a great, like, sort of like devil may care history to it. I mean, when you think about collage, like historically, it's often intersected with revolution and, antagonism in the best and often the best ways possible, political protest. I mean, it really is like a form that feels, I don't want to offend anyone, but like it's just a middle finger at times to what it goes up against. And I like that about it. So I think that's another reason that it's always kind of stuck around with me, is its rebellious spirit. That's a nicer way to put it. Rebellious spirit.
I think we could talk about all the meanings of collage for a long time, but we're getting close to when I know the audience wants to ask questions, but I wanted to address a quote, your forthcoming book that I want you to talk about. Right. You wrote I'm going to let you explain that, but you wrote this beautiful line in the intro, and I wondered if you could elaborate on it, because I think it's so informative. To take care of oneself is to take care of the world and vice versa. Do you mind kind of elaborating on your meaning of that?
Sure. It's a nice, I like ending on that sentiment. I think definitely over the past like few years, maybe 5 years, I've never really looked at myself as a politically motivated artist necessarily. I mean, it's always about making for me first and foremost, which I think can be political in its own way, but my work has never been overtly political. And as I alluded to a couple times in the talk, given my subject is nature and my process is naturally inspired, over the years, as things have maybe become a little bit more dire and a little bit more present in terms of like, are we going to preserve where we live? Are we going to take care of who we habitate the planet with? And as that has become more present, I've just kind of thought like, okay, well, I don't actually feel so comfortable just kind of staying passive entirely on that front with my work. I mean, I also I do think it's important to kind of approach those ideas with different tones and in different ways, especially because I think the message gets across when depending on how you deliver it, more successfully sometimes than not. And when I look back at, which is why I wanted to share all that source material with you all in the beginning. When I look back at what I've collected over the years, like there is a very political worldview there. I haven't always been direct in how I communicate it, but this idea that like we might see ourselves in the world around us and vice versa, and that humans might not be like, why necessarily are we at the top of that hierarchy? I'm not sure. I don't really think there's a compelling, I mean, there's reasons one could make for that, but I don't think that's the most generous way to look at the world and take care of it. So this idea to try to find that reciprocal idea of care, I think is important, especially now. It just feels like, there's sort of a limit to a threshold that I think we're all coming to terms with in different ways of, if we cross this too far, like there's not really any turning it around. So yeah, I think that plays out like kind of in every way. I mean, it's uncomfortable to talk about politics sometimes, but it's kind of playing out on many a stage right now. And so that just seemed like a sentiment that, I wanted to make really clear about, like, nature is beautiful and glorious, and there are many ways to appreciate it, but there are also, it's powerful, it's threatening, it's all these things that I think we go to great efforts, many of us, to try to edit and present a certain way so that it's palatable, manageable, digestible, ignorable, whatever any manner of adjective. But if we can break down that sort of us, or like us and other in lots of different ways, I think we'd be better off. The world would be better. So that's kind of, I hope that answers, that's what I was thinking about when I wrote that sentiment, because I do think it runs through the work, and it is, if I had a message, that's what I would primarily want it to be.
No, I think that's really powerful. I understand. I know it's such a difficult time. and yet so many things are coming and together, and seeing what's happening with the weather and the change that's constantly brewing, and then that's during a pandemic. But I think that also that sense of self-care we can all learn from. So, I mean, that's a powerful sentiment in itself. I know we want to get to some questions, but do you want to just kind of briefly talk about your book, your forthcoming book, and when it's coming out? And I mean, it's a beautiful book, everybody. It's really brilliantly designed. So
Sure, I can say a quick, I can give a quick plug. It's the first book I think I've ever made. So that's exciting. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to collect. It's basically a collection of documentation of 3 shows. In the Night Garden being one, Maneater at Mass Mocha, and Sideways to the Sun at the Moody, and each show is accompanied. I think I might have one more image. Here we go. One more image of a mock-up, an earlier mock-up actually. So you'll see something different if you get the book. But with essays by 3 amazing writers, Shirley as one of them. Thank you, Shirley. Kind of taking 3 different takes on these 3 different installations. And I mean, it's great. It's wonderful to have the documentation of the 3 shows and to kind of show the through line and how one work kind of fed and led to another. But it was also really, what's been amazing is just to kind of have the opportunity to, have writers kind of dig into some of the things that I've thought about with the work, and allow that to have, just to go more in depth there, to talk about influences, to talk about connections to feminism, to witchcraft, to all these different things that like I kind of meander through as an artist, but having the opportunity to really kind of have this place for these essays that make grounds for these connections in really interesting ways has been, I mean, that's just that's success to me. I mean, I hope everyone enjoys it. It's going to be at the Amen in hopefully late September. It's at the printer. And I called it Wild-Eyed because I kind of wanted to. Wild-Eyed is typically not a kind word for not a kind descriptor often attached to women. You don't hear men being called wild-eyed very often, although I'm sure there's like one instance of it, but there's like thousands of instances of women being claimed as wild-eyed, usually as a negative. But I like the idea of kind of reclaiming it as something that was to be desired. I want to look at the world in a wild way. So I thought, why not reclaim this word that, like, why is it negative? It doesn't really sound negative to me. So that's sort of where the title came from as well.
Madeline, do you want to take us through some questions?
Sure. We've only had 2. Let me pull up the list. We answered one already from Ravetta about how long one of these takes. Mary Riverton asked a really great question. Did you ever do cutout dolls and cutout clothing as a young girl?
That's a good, I maybe cut out animal dolls. I've always been an animal person, like literally from the beginning. I never was, humans were less interesting to me. So I didn't do a lot of doll cutouts, but I did like make a lot of animal drawings and like, cut paper puppets, stuff like that. Definitely as a kid, but not so many human dolls.
That is brilliant.
I like that question. I've never gotten that question before. It's a cool question.
Kenny Jones asked, where will you be exhibiting next? Any chance you will be in New Mexico?
Oh, I would love to make my way back to New Mexico. I'm trying to think. I haven't met, I'm on the edge of a major life event. So I haven't really thought about I'm about to have a baby. So I haven't thought about exhibitions in a moment. But I would love to come back to New Mexico. I don't have any current plans, although I do have a lot of near and dear people to me in New Mexico. So I'm sure I will be back, and I will let you know. Or send out the back signal somehow. I do have, so I'm going to make my first outdoor work for a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that will open next summer in their sculpture garden. And that's exciting because that is totally new territory that I have never even tiptoed in before, but have thought about often. I mean, it makes intuitive sense to put something natural back out into nature. So that is coming up next summer. And then I have like some things that are not, that are sort of works in progress, but some collaborations. I as you may have gleaned from the last few things I showed, I'm seeking out collaboration a lot more than I ever did for many years. And so I have a zine that I'm working on with a dear friend in Houston, Sarah Welch, who's an amazing artist herself. I hope she doesn't mind me mentioning this because it's still very much in the works, but we're working on kind of we've been doing a sort of drawing exchange together. So I don't know how that will, like where that will manifest, but I'm getting into other things too that are a little bit more collaborative and unwieldy in a good way. Yeah.
That kind of leads perfectly to another question that you kind of almost answered, I think. But Christiana Odom asked, do you have a dream location that you would like to present your work?
That's a great question. Oh man. I mean, bottom of the ocean. I mean, the first things that come to mind are like the totally impractical, fantastical places. But feasible, let's see, feasible places. I mean, I have thought about, there's some amazing, like very famous gardens all over the world that I've thought would be interesting sites to do something with. I've been interested with what's happening. The past couple of shows, I think it's at the Bronx Botanical Garden where they did at Yo-Yo Kusama is there now. And Roberto Burrell, if I'm getting his last name right, he was an amazing landscape architect and artist. They had an exhibition of his work there. I like the idea of doing something that's in nature, in a different kind of manifestation of nature. I mean, gardens are also kind of artificial and, they can be. And so I like that idea of trying to bring my work into a different kind of, to marry with another artistic interpretation of dealing with nature, I think would be interesting.
So I'm sorry, I have to interrupt and ask, because you mentioned this earlier. You said you'd love to design sets for an opera. So which opera? Is there an opera you have in mind?
I don't know. I mean, so I say opera, maybe I should just say stage. I'm not an opera aficionado or aficionada, but I I saw a show. I didn't mention him tonight, but Maurice Sendak is a love of mine and inspiration for In the Night Garden as well. And I saw a show of his a few years ago at the Morgan Library in New York, where they had his drawings for these sets that he did for, I think he did one for Midsummer's Night Dream. They did a stage version of Where the Wild Things Are. So some were of his own stories, but then some were in response to other theatrical performances. And that got me thinking like, oh, I want to make something for the stage and I want it to move. And so I don't have a particular opera, but I have been thinking like, well, I should just make drawings. Like, I'll just pick something, make some drawings, and then I'll convince someone that it's a good idea. So yeah, if anyone has any suggestions, put them in the chat. I'm all ears. Something that has a lot of nature that I could really go wild with, I think would make the best sense. Or like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I would love to do like a stage set for that. I don't know if anyone's trying to bring that to the stage. Probably not, but yeah. So yeah, maybe one day.
Kind of along that same line of experimenting with different locations. Have you ever tried quilting? Laura asks.
I have not. This is weird to say this. I'm not sure I have the enough patience, but that's weird to say because I mean, I do plenty of things that require a lot of patience. So I'm not sure why that is. Why I think that I have tried to sew occasionally, and I'm quite bad at it. Not to say that I wouldn't try it again, but while I have not quilted myself, I do love to look at crazy quilts, specifically that kind of abstract tradition of kind of quilting off a like where the pattern kind of breaks down and it becomes like a sort of like chaos in the form of a quilt. I do really love those. So I've looked at them, but I have never made any myself.
Well, and along that same line, we had an anonymous question asking if there are other media that you have enjoyed, like clay, fiber, wood, etc.
Yeah, I've dabbled in clay. Actually, when I was in New Mexico, I did some clay work out there because I mean, there's such a rich tradition of amazing artists working in clay. And occasionally my work requires some sculptural elements, but I am not, given how I make the rest of my work, I shouldn't say this when I'm about to make an outdoor sculpture. I'm going to get help with that. Someone is helping with the fabrication of that. It's very ad hoc. I don't like, because of my sort of anti-planning sentiments, my sculpture tends to look a little crazy and can fall over at times. But you know, I like to try new things for sure. But I would say clay and wood are within that list are things that I have tried. Never, I find steel and things that are more resistant to hand a little less appealing, just because of the way that I tend to get drawn into my own processes. I need something that will respond to my touch, basically, often more than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we have two questions left, so we're going to go a little over on our time, but they should be quick. Katie Beard asked if you could collaborate with your dream artist alive today or not, who would you most be inspired to work with?
Oh boy, these are very good hard questions. Oh. Well, okay. A couple, I guess I'll just say the two first names that come into my mind are Leigh Bonteque. So Leigh Bonteque, if you want to work together, I'm all in. I don't know what we would make, but she's been an inspiration for a long time. And I guess I would have loved to have been part of the 7. I don't know if people are familiar with, or is it the 5? It might be the 5. I think it's the 5. Hilma af Klint is another artist that I've been interested in for a while, and she's had kind of a resurgence over the past years, coming back into the public eye. But she and her work is amazing. But I'm really interested in she kind of made work collaboratively for a while, in addition to her independent output, with I think 4 other women, not 6 other women. But that would be amazing. That would be a pretty interesting thing, I think, to put my hand to.
2 strong female artists. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, the last one we have is from an anonymous attendee, and upon reading it, it's not exactly a question, but I think it's a nice way to end this, because it's an aspect of In the Night Garden that you didn't really touch on today. This person wrote, "It might not have been intentional, but I think it's very interesting to see the vibrance and action of the piece. And then after you step behind the piece or to the sides, you see all of the infrastructure that supports all of that beautiful transformation and color." I just thought maybe you had something you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, that's a really, that's a great point. And I think for me, I don't want to over psychoanalyze my upbringing too much on public stage, but given how I grew up and kind of what I was around as a kid, and watching all my family worked with their hands in different ways for their occupations, there was a directness to that way of working, a frankness, it just needs to work. It doesn't need frills. In fact, frills are, to be avoided or suspicious. I think that there's something about that idea of craft that got instilled in me just by not intentionally. I just picked it up by watching people work as a kid. And so I like that kind of humble straightforwardness. And I mean, the other part of it too is when you make something that is on the face, flashy and beautiful, I don't want that to be the only read. I think that would be a mistake and not a complete vision of, it's not the full picture. And so having allowing you to see the guts of something and see that there's sandbags in the back, it's very unglorious from the back side. I think that's important. I don't want to make exclusively, pretty, fragile, beautiful things, because that's kind of part of what the whole pushing back on the symbolism of these things, of how flowers are often represented, of how women are often represented. There's all this doesn't it look nice when it's all dressed up, and I just think that any way I can kind of combat that or offer a fuller picture, that's what I want to be doing. I don't want to just show one side of things. So that's a great point to bring up that I forgot about my own work. Thank you. Anonymous question.
All right. Well, we are at 7:40, so we went 10 minutes over, but thank you, Natasha and Shirley, and also TCC again for all of your help this evening. and for joining us. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I think there were a couple in the chat that I may have missed, and I apologize. Natasha Bowden's exhibition in the Night Garden can be seen in person at the Carter until December 12th, 2021. So you've got a couple more months left to go. And again, if you're interested in purchasing Natasha's book, Wild Eyed, when it comes out, you can add the book to your wish list at the Carter's Museum shop that I shared the link for in the chat. But thank you all again for being here this evening, and we hope to see you at the Carter soon. Have a nice night.